My name is Dick Roman. I'm going to chair and I'm also going to speak. I want to mention a couple of things at the beginning. One is that some of you, I think, were there. We had a wonderful meeting Wednesday night on similar topics. This is, in a way, an extension of that meeting. One of the speakers who had to return to Mexico City, Luis Hernandez Navarro, who is the opinion page editor for La Jornada, was interviewed by Rick Salutin, who has a column in today's Star, a very nice column, about both Luis himself and the situation in Mexico. On tonight's meeting, we're really very fortunate to have three Mexican speakers and one non-Mexican speaker. I don't know if that's fortunate, but three Mexican speakers. One of them is Hepzibah Munoz, who will speak first. Hepzibah is professor of history and politics at the University of New Brunswick, but she's originally from and grew up in Mexico in Ciudad Victoria in the state of Tamaulipas, which is a state of tremendous violence and problems, as you'll hear tonight. She has done accompaniment work with the United Forces of Our Disappeared in Coahuila since 2012, and she has a blog called NoMoreBloodInMexico.org. It's one word, NoMoreBloodInMexico.org, which focuses on solidarity work between Mexico and Canada in the area of human rights. We're not going to focus on Ayotzinapa tonight, though if people have questions, we can go into it in more detail in the discussion period, because I think most people are familiar with it. But just the words before the speakers, and that is, 6 students were killed, 43 disappeared. One of the students who was murdered was mutilated brutally, and the government was either carried it out or was complicit in it. And there's a lot of stuff been written about it, and we can go into more details later, but the evidence is very clear, and different human rights groups have supported that interpretation. The government just denies everything and hopes it goes away. And the president said a couple months ago, time to move on. The students have not been reappeared. The parents of the students, the families of the students from a very poor rural area of the state of Guerrero, continue to be the moral leadership of protests in Mexico. And in fact, they're now on a tour of the U.S. trying to mobilize support. Okay, so we're going to start with Hepzibah.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. So I'm going to talk more about what happened with disappearances before Ayotzinapa. And one of the things that I'm hoping to do with this is to kind of help us understand disappearances in Mexico beyond state weakness or strength, or beyond individual liberal human rights framework. Of course, the latter is important as well, but I think we need to also think about the Mexican case as an important case to study, even in Canada, to understand the transformation of the democratic facade of the neoliberal state into some other form of neoliberalism with different political instruments of managing dissent and repressing social discontent, which in a way, in some ways happening also in Canada with that recent bill. So, and in addition to that, I would like to address how the Mexican case also gives us or shows a class dimension of state and non-state terror. So, as I said, I'm gonna talk about the situation of disappearances before Ayotzinapa. So, in general, the numbers are differ, but there's some consensus about the number of disappearances since 2006 reached more than 20,000 people. And with the recent government from the PRI of Enrique Peña Nieto, there has been since I guess 3 years ago or 2 years ago, there have been 10,000 disappearances. So statistically speaking, 1.5 people have disappeared per day during the new presidential administration. So my field work is in two areas in the in northeastern Mexico. These two states are Coahuila and Tamaulipas. And in my perspective, these two cases are important to understand this transformation that I talked about. Because, first of all, disappearances did not really happen before in a massive way in the recent era, right? There was a lot of repression and disappearances in southern Mexico, some parts of central Mexico, but you don't really have this issue of disappearances and upfront political repression of consent in those areas. In these areas, you have the permanence of the authoritarian party that existed at the national level. The authoritarian structure that existed in Mexico for more than 70 years stayed at the local level in those two states. Even it continued and helped to support even the opposition at the federal level, especially the neoliberal agenda pushed by the opposition, the right-wing National Action Party at the federal level. So in that sense, we can see that neoliberalism was locally implemented through the PRI and supported by the opposition party, the PAN. So another reason why this case is important is because in these states you have huge support for the neoliberal agenda. All the investment went there. Everyone felt like they received the benefits of the promises of free trade and the export processing zones. Just to give you myself as an example, the program I took in Mexico was for people to work in the export processing zones, and the best job you could have at the time graduating was to work in an export processing plant or maquiladora. So everyone was very happy about neoliberalism, and that area of the country really helped to fragment national opposition to neoliberalism in the country, mostly from the middle class, but also parts of the working class. So this is my field work, and I think this is important for those reasons. So disappearances have taken place in Mexico. The perpetrators are either the military, the municipal police, the state police, the federal police, or the immigration authorities, organized crime. Sometimes you don't know, because there have been cases where the transit police detains people and then delivers them to a drug cartel, or sometimes, which is the case, what happens in my state, state officials hire drug cartels to kill someone that is disagreeing with the political agenda of the PRI in the state. So, and also what is interesting and sad is the fact that it's not only the state against civilians, but also police forces disappearing lower rank of the police forces. For instance, I've heard cases when I met with the families, there are cases where there are moms of members of the federal police saying, my son was disappeared, and I know that he was disappeared by his commander, for instance. So it's not only civilians versus state forces, but also state forces disappearing their own state forces. So I want to talk a little bit about what the families go through when trying to access justice. And I think that's very telling of the class dimension of that disappearances have. For instance, in I think it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I talked to these families, and their husbands, I talked to 9 women, and their husbands, who were telecommunication workers, were disappeared. all at once. Witnesses say that armed forces, this happened in Laredo, Tamaulipas, and witnesses say that these telecommunication workers went there to do some work for a maquiladora, an export processing plant. They were from northwestern Mexico, so they went to northeastern Mexico. They were kidnapped, they're abducted. Witnesses say that armed men got into the apartment where they were staying, and nearby there were federal police forces. So they went to the state prosecutor. The only thing that the state prosecutor did was, we don't have any more lines of investigation. I'm sorry, but the case, we're not going to keep searching until we find new evidence. Of course, that hasn't happened yet. So what you can see in this case is not only the lack of access to justice by the families, but also the fact that this trend of disappearing groups of people existed before Ayotzinapa. Another case in Allende, Coahuila, 300 people were disappeared from this town, the municipality of Allende, 80 families. There have been other cases reported by the United Forces for Our Disappeared in Coahuila that report an entire family disappeared. From the there was this family that had a party, so from the baby to the grandpa were disappeared. 10 people. So in that sense, there were group disappearances taking place even before Ayotzinapa. And what's interesting is, the question for me is, why don't we haven't heard anything about it before Ayotzinapa? And for me, an answer would be that it has to do with how the PRI-led neoliberalism at the local level shaped contestation to disappearances. So one of the things that has happened is that because all the promise of because lots of people work for maquiladoras and they're more individualistic about how to fulfill their needs, they fear participating in any march. They fear helping families of the disappeared because they say, if I help them, my family is also going to be disappeared. So in the North, the issue of disappearances is treated more like an individual issue. Okay, well, I'm sorry, that's so bad. That's too bad that your son, your father, your girlfriend was disappeared. But yeah, it hasn't happened to me, so I'm not worrying about it. So there is no support from the community, lots of fragmentation, which shows how the relationship between violence and neoliberalism is very complex. And the complexity, and I'm going to give you two examples of this, of the relationship between violence and neoliberalism in Mexico. The first has to do with the declaration of absence. One of the problems that families are facing once their relatives disappeared is that they lose a source of income. So not only they have to do it in the investigation, because authorities don't do anything, but they also have to find resources to finance their own investigation and finance their own survival, especially in situations where the person that was disappeared was the main source of income. But the problem is that there's no body. So they can't prove, they cannot receive a pension because there's no body, there's no one is being declared dead, right? But at the same time, the person is not coming to work because he's disappeared, so the families are in this limbo. So in a way, they're not only distressed because of the situation they're in, but also the whole context of economic disempower has led to political disempowerment in the face of disappearances, and then the disappearances add even more to the economic insecurity that these families face, which diminishes the strength, or it weakens social protest against disappearances. Because sometimes I've seen some families that they say, well, like I have to work and also have to go to the lawyer and I have to go to the public prosecutor office. There's no time to do any strategizing or resistance, especially when you don't have the support of the community. The second example, and I'm going to end with this, is Another example of the complex relationship between neoliberalism and violence in Mexico has to do again with Coahuila. The case of drug cartels, a drug cartel forcing miners to work in clandestine coal pits to extract coal in very bad conditions, and then the drug cartel selling this coal to the public electricity company in order to obtain coal at low cost and provide the energy fulfill the energy consumption needs of the industry in that area of the country. So the lines between state organized crime, the formal or the legal economy and the illegal economy are blurred, and in fact they help each other. They coexist and they help each other. I hope with these examples I show the class dimension of disappearances and drug-related violence in the country, which is not new, but it shows some sort of transformation of the political form of the neoliberal state. And so I think it's important to raise the question: who benefits from this violence and terror? Because the consequences are not even. And in my opinion, the private sector, the elites, are actually receiving a lot of benefits from this violence. Because in the north, people fear to even raise questions, especially in the northeast. Unions or workers fear to actually protest or raise any disagreement or disagree with wages, for instance, or talk about the labor conditions because they're afraid that somehow they're going to be disappeared and no one will know who did it. So in that sense, for the private sector, violence is not a big issue. It's more like an inconvenience, and if you're a manager of a private company, you have your investment in Mexico, you just move to San Antonio, Texas, and then you fly back and forth. Or as I talked to one of top people in 7-Eleven in Mexico, they said, well, we actually have a budget line for bribery and fines, and to pay fines to organized crime to let us operate. So for the economic and the political elites, violence is merely an inconvenience, but in a way it's, so in that sense, I'm almost just one thing. So we have to think about the class dimensions of violence and terror, and to understand that this relationship between neoliberalism and violence in Mexico is more complex, because most of the analysis say, oh, neoliberalism creates poverty and the poor become criminals and then they become part of organized crime, and that's why violence happens. But that ends up criminalizing the poor. It doesn't really question the structures of power that set the conditions for disappearances in the country and for their economic and political disempowerment.
Thank you so much, Hepzibah.